I think we're all shocked by what we saw in Bucha and other settlements in the Kiev region after their liberation. The reality is, wherever Ukrainian or international journalists went after areas that were liberated from Russian forces, they uncovered atrocities committed by the Russian army. We saw this in the Kherson and Kharkiv regions in autumn 2022. Unfortunately, we will likely continue to see more evidence of war crimes in newly liberated territories. When it comes to places like Mariupol and Enerhodar or other cities that remain under occupation, we know much less simply because there is no access for independent reporting. You and I cannot go there, you know?
Welcome to the St. Martin's Cloak podcast, where we go behind the headlines to focus on humans, not statistics. On today's episode, we're speaking with Elina Beketova, a research fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, a renowned think tank in Washington, D.C. We hear from Elina as she recounts her experiences living through the Russian full-scale invasion of 2022, her subsequent arrival in the United States, and her work reporting on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. With extensive experience in journalism, she provides us with unique insights into what life is really like under Russian occupation, what challenges she faces in reporting on those unique situations, and the importance of sharing the stories of Ukrainians, all as negotiations about the future of their country carry on in the background. But first, a quick introduction. Hello everyone, this is Miloš recording from London.
And this is Andrew Loftusness recording from Istanbul.
So Andrew, we're back with Ukraine, this time with Elina Beketova. How did you feel about the interview?
I mean, really great interview. Elina, thank you again very much for your time and your very unique insight. We covered a number of very interesting topics. Primarily, though, our focus was on the reality of life inside the temporarily occupied territories inside of Ukraine. I don't think it's that often at this point in the war that you hear, at least, I can't comment on Ukrainian media. Of course, that's a completely different story. But in the States, you don't hear from people who are actually from those parts of the country very often and who have family ties to parts of Ukraine that are currently occupied.
This is really an area that Elina is an expert in. And I should say that she is originally from Ukraine. She goes a bit into her backstory during the interview, obviously, but she moved to the United States shortly after the full-scale invasion. She's originally from Crimea. And Crimea, obviously, has been in the news and was occupied and annexed by Russia back in 2014, so way longer than just the past 5 years of the full-scale invasion. So, yeah, exactly what you said. I mean, it's been so long now that it's almost become this new status quo that Crimea and the east of the country, they are these occupied territories. Life is kind of stagnant as that status, and, the world moves on. But rightfully so, Elina does a great job, not only in her own work that we referenced several times, but also during the interview of showing us that life does go on. Life is really difficult under Russian occupation, and it's important to shed light on that. And I think we do so in this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at this point, there's not even that much in the news in terms of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. And, negotiations, I think we could say that in air quotes almost at this point. But even when before the start of the war in Iran, when that was one of the bigger international stories that was getting a lot of airtime, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding basically anywhere outside of Ukraine about the importance of this land and the people who live on that land and that part of Ukraine's history and identity. And of course, we have strong opinions about that, about what the right thing would be for the international community to do. But the main reason I was very grateful to have Elina on the show is that I think the best thing that we can do here is talk to people who are actually from those parts of Ukraine and let them explain to an English-speaking audience about what the world is misunderstanding about those parts of their country.
Yeah, exactly. She said something at one point during the interview, which was rather striking to me, which was that a lot of people with regards to Ukraine have already made up their mind on which sides they want to be, right? It's been going on for a couple of years. At this point, a lot of people have chosen whether they support Ukraine or whether they're ambivalent or whether they're for Russia even. And it's really difficult to try and convince any one of those camps to alter their mind, right? And, full disclosure, we hope that most people are towards the first, i.e. backing Ukraine and backing its rights to self-determination and a victory in this war. But it's really difficult. And then, the best one can do, or like one of the steps that one has to do, is to remind everyone that these are still people we're talking about. The eastern part of Ukraine has been under Russian occupation and all the hardships that come with it for the past, as I mentioned, 12 years now. And it's an area that's been under continuous bombardment, all for what, right? It's how much gains have the Russians made in the past 5 years, in the past year, in the past 14 years? They it's been marginal increases in territory, and at the same time, that is having huge effects on not only Ukrainians within the country, but also Ukrainians abroad. And we have to keep telling their story and hearing from them what we can do to help them.
Yeah, 100%. And, I thought it was very interesting to hear Elina's thoughts on visiting and talking to people in different parts of the United States who, as you were just saying, some people are, they find out she's Ukrainian and they love it. They're about it. They want to support the defense of Ukraine. Other people simply might not know much about what is going on. And then on the far end of that spectrum, you have people who, and we talked about this in the interview, simply do not care, or as you also just mentioned, actually support the Russian narrative in the war. But when she was telling these stories, it was very interesting. My family is from North Dakota, and that's a part of the country. I'll put it this way. After the start of the war in Ukraine, I saw a number of Ukrainian flags in the streets in the front yards of Bismarck, North Dakota, and Ukrainian flags on bumper stickers in the back of people's cars. And I have never seen that kind of support for a foreign country in a state of conflict in that part of the United States ever. And uh, I live in Turkey right now, but usually I live in DC, and driving through the different parts of Virginia or West Virginia, you see quite a bit of that as well. It's very interesting. And when you do see that, it is very encouraging. But, for a number of reasons that we have discussed, you don't see that quite as much anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And with her journalist background, she understands that a lot of it is due to the natural news cycle that happens. And, you mentioned Washington, D.C. It was also quite interesting to hear her experience working in D.C. as a think tanker, working with policymakers and other researchers there, and how it differs from just standard journalism. And it's all great stuff, and all stuff that we can learn from. And it's just been interesting. We did this with Lebanon as well, to talk to people not only on the ground, which we did with Ukraine in our previous episode, but to now also hear from the people who are, perhaps geographically removed and in the States and in a position more of, speaking truth and facts to the people in charge, and getting an insight into how it is all connected and how it still is an issue that's very close to their hearts. So, to echo what Andrew said, I mean, thank you so much, Elina, for coming on and sharing all those insights. And I hope that that our listeners can all gain something from it.
Yeah, I have no doubt that people will get a lot out of this interview. I know that I did personally. So before we get into the interview, just a very quick public service announcement. This is our second episode on Ukraine, but it's also just the beginning of our coverage. So if anyone listening is from the advocacy, humanitarian, or policy space with a foot in any of those doors as it relates to Ukraine, especially if you yourself are Ukrainian. But we'd be very glad to talk to you. So we will put information in the description of this episode of how you can get in touch with us. But we would love to hear from you.
Absolutely. And for now, we'd like to present you Elina Beketova.
Elina, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming on the show. To kick things off, do you mind just telling us about yourself, maybe a little bit about your professional background and when you left Ukraine to come to the United States?
Yeah, sure. So, my name is Elina Beketova. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Before, I was a journalist, a Ukrainian journalist, originally from Crimea. I lived in the eastern part of Ukraine, Kharkiv, and then I lived in Kyiv for many years, working as a journalist and a television anchor. Then I left Kyiv in March 2022 when the full-scale invasion began. So I think my biggest realization was that I didn't know how I would react in a war. So when it began, I thought I would stay, but then I got scared. My friends were leaving, my family was far away, and one of my friends offered to go to the west part of Ukraine where it was safer. But I had just started driving and I didn't feel confident enough to go on my own. So I stayed in Kyiv when the full scale invasion began. And, you kind of don't know how you would react when a war starts and like how you would react to shellings, to attacks, to like work of the anti-missile system. At some point, I realized how unsafe I felt, so and that was my instinct to leave. So a friend from Germany called me and asked what I was doing, and I was just sitting in the bathroom because that felt like the safest place in my apartment. And she just told me to come to stay with her. At that time, I was a student at a Ukrainian university studying psychology. So we had a support session with colleagues, future psychologists, and one of my colleagues, whose husband was in the military, she told us that if we had the chance to leave the city for a while, we should, because it would make it easier for the men to defend it. I felt that maybe I should go at least for a week. So I left. I thought that I would just leave for a week. I took an evacuation train and stood for 13 hours because it was completely full. Like all the trains that were going to the western part of Ukraine were like completely full, and people would be just standing, there. So, and the interesting part, the conductor in our carriage was the mother of Dmitro Kazatsky, Ukrainian defender and photographer. During the siege of Mariupol, he was among those defending the Azovstal plant. At the time, we didn't know any of that. But I remember his mother, despite the overcrowded carriage, she managed to keep everything under control. There were people everywhere, along with cats and dogs. So that was the journey that was like for me in March 2022. This is how I fled Kyiv in 2022, living all my life there and thinking that I would come back just in a week or two, because when the war starts, you just don't know how to react and you don't know anything about it. And it felt like, okay, probably in a week or two, everything will be cleared. Like the world will stop this bloody war and everything will be as it used to be. But it hasn't been normal since then.
And so, how was it then going from thinking that you would go back in a week to you actually ending up in the United States?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting story. So I came there thinking that it would be like for a week or two, but I came to Germany. I lived in Hamburg for some time with my friend. She's actually also from Crimea, and I joined Ukrainskaya Pravda as a volunteer translator for the English version of their website because they just launched the English version of their website. And I was just terrified by what Russian forces were doing in the temporarily occupied territories. And when I saw a fellowship opportunity in Washington, D.C., I decided to apply with the idea of helping Western audiences understand what it feels like to live under occupation. So before the full-scale invasion, I hadn't actually researched this topic. It was very new to me because, as I said, I've been working as a journalist and anchor at many television stations in Kharkiv and Kyiv. But being in Germany, I actually realized that many people didn't fully understand why Ukrainians wanted to live freely and not under occupation. That's what sparked my interest in this issue. So I applied to CEPA with this idea and was selected for the fellowship. I also felt that as someone originally from Crimea who had witnessed certain things firsthand, I could help explain complex realities to Western audiences who have never experienced occupation. I don't think international media always gets these territories wrong. For instance, right now, I just feel that there are gaps. For example, some narratives suggest that only pro-Russian populations live there, which isn't actually true. More importantly, there is often too little reporting on the human consequences for people living under occupation. And I just wanted to say thank you to you guys that you are having the podcast, that you are actually telling the stories, and you are trying to talk with Ukrainians, and you're, bringing their voices to your program, because this is very important.
Well, it sounds like we're both in the same line of work then, because you are a pioneer in this work. And I want to direct our listeners to your series that you write for CEPA called Behind the Lines, in which you focus, as you mentioned, on the reality of living in the temporarily occupied territories in Ukraine, which is just a fantastic series, and it goes into all sorts of detail. So we'll be linking that out. And on that point, I mean, you've already talked about some of the things that perhaps are misrepresented in international media, but in your own experience on a technical level, what are some of the challenges in reporting about those territories in general?
Well, that's a great question. I just feel like there are challenges in terms of people have never gone through the experience of living in the wartime situation or under occupation. That is why it's okay that they don't know what it feels like. I remember even right now when I meet some people and they ask me, "So what's wrong, with this territory? So why is it so dangerous?" They just don't understand what it fully means. In many perceptions, if a person is alive, then it's okay. But we all understand that no, it's not okay. And actually, for people living under occupation, they go through many consequences of being under occupation, and this is what not all people understand. Because for some, it's just okay, like it is what it is. A person is alive, so it's good, but it's not. And in my series Behind the Lines, I try to just explain what it means for people living there. That first, when Russian forces come there, they close the territory, they impose their rules, Russian rules, and the Russian law that works over there. So if you're Ukrainian living there, it's very hard to maintain and keep your Ukrainian identity, because everything that is going on there aims to erase your Ukrainian identity and just show you that, okay, if you stay here, you have to respect the Russian law, you have to obtain the Russian passport, you have to have it in order to get any type of medical service. If you want to prove that this is your property, or like this is your house, or like your apartment where you have been living all your life, you actually have to prove that this is your apartment. But in order to prove, you have to obtain the Russian passport and go to the like Russian administration, or collaborators working in this like the occupation administration, and show them all the documents. So everything that is going on there is just it's wild. And it's not normal. And people who don't have this understanding, or who don't have this experience, which is normal, people don't have to live under occupation. People have to be free, right? They have to be able to choose where they live, and they don't have to live somewhere when people just come with weapons and invade their territory. So, and then we're just talking about hundreds of consequences. In my Behind the Line series, I just there is a tracker, and there is series of articles that I write. So the series of articles is just I take any particular question, like how Russian forces change the basically the population that live on temporarily occupied territories. They just bring people from Russia living in temporarily occupied territories, and they give them incentives. They give them cheap mortgages. And then, like, if a teacher or a doctor from mainland of Russia wants to live in Mariupol or in Energodar, then this person can totally do it, because Russian forces give them incentives and bonuses, like in terms of cheap mortgages. And there are hundreds of stories like that. And also, I have like a tracker. A tracker is a shorter way to understand what's going on there. I just cover a couple of categories like militarization, propaganda, economy, Russification, war crimes, and humanitarian crisis. devices. So it's behind the lines tracker. You can just like basically see in real time what's going on there, and I just basically write 2 3 sentences about it. And I do it because I want people to understand what it means, because it's just so far away. People don't have the experience to relate to, and that is why they think, oh, they will be all right, they're alive at some point, at least they're alive, this is what I hear. But the consequences are far more than we can even grasp.
So I understand that you've also worked as a fixer for journalists who want to cover Ukraine. What are
Mhm.
some challenges that you have encountered with international journalists, perhaps when it comes to the narrative or maybe any presumptions or prejudices that they might have going into Ukraine for the first time?
Well, when I was in Germany, I worked with a local production agency on a story about Ukraine using my photos and sharing my personal experience. Germany, by the way, has done a lot and continues to do a lot by offering temporary protection to thousands of Ukrainians. And we know that all the countries in Europe offer to Ukrainians, the temporary protection status, and thousands of Ukrainians can live and try to build their temporary lives elsewhere. At the same time, I noticed that many people tend to avoid the topic of war almost as if not thinking about it might make it less real. But I believe one of the biggest challenges since 2022 has been the realization that war is much closer than many people expected. Personally, I didn't face major challenges in terms of getting attention to the issue, especially at the beginning of the full scale invasion when many media outlets wanted to cover Ukraine. I also worked with TV stations in Mississippi, where I had been an exchange student 16 years ago, and I found that especially meaningful because it showed strong engagement even from southern states in the US in the beginning of the full scale invasion. So I didn't face any like challenges. I felt like there was a lot of interest to Ukraine, to stories from Ukraine. I feel like it's just much more or less right now because Ukraine, unfortunately, is not the only war in the world right now. And I feel like this is a natural process when people can't think about the war 24/7. It's a natural process when people do want to know about something, they try to find information, but when there is a limit, there is a limit. And everyone's lives are, very unique. Some people can read more about the war, some people just cannot. I feel like right now it's definitely less coverage, but just because psychologically it cannot last forever. And we as Ukrainians, we understand that people will pay attention to other wars and to other events happening in the world, right now with the Middle East and, Iran, and people think mostly about like gas prices or grocery prices in the store, and this is like the human nature. Sometimes people can think about something else when their lives are stable and when they are okay. If they are not okay, there is no way they will be thinking about like Ukraine and Ukrainians, unfortunately. But that's life, and we all understand it.
On a related note, have you noticed any changes in international media coverage of the war over the past 5 years and perhaps in public perception of the war in the United States or in Europe?
Well, I've definitely noticed these changes in media coverage. I think it's just less, but also I wouldn't. I think it's also natural because in journalism we used to say story lives for about 3 days. People talk about it and then they just move on. And honestly, the same thing happens with the war, with any war. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only war in the world right now, and we've seen it when something really bad happens, the media shows up. There is coverage, there is urgency, and then a few months later, it goes quiet again. This is just how the news cycle works, and unfortunately, there is nothing I can do about that. I've just noticed that sometimes there are months, especially with the negotiations going, when journalists do reach out to me, and they were like, "Okay, can you just comment something? Can you give us a quote?" And then for a few months there is nothing, and I'm like sitting there and I'm like, oh my god, people forgot about Ukraine. It's but then I talk with some other specialists and they're like, yeah, there is always, when there is something else going on like another war in the Middle East, they do forget about Ukraine because this is how the news cycle work. I also think that there is sometimes this idea, especially outside Ukraine, that there is a kind of magic solution. maybe through negotiations. Ukrainians don't really see it that way. For them, the only real guarantee is their own army and building a country strong enough to defend itself, even when allies' policies change. So, unfortunately, there is no simple answer here. We will notice even less coverage, and it will be existing in waves. The media will pay attention, and then it will look away, and Ukrainians will keep fighting and will keep fighting for their own country. That's how it is.
So, given that that is unfortunately the reality of coverage of Ukraine at this point in 2026, what do you wish that people understood about both the war and Ukraine itself and the Ukrainian people that you feel is not being covered properly in international media right now?
Well, I think it's a great question, but I think it's just with we think that they might be better sometimes, and I feel that if we talk about different waves that exist, so if there is a wave that right now people's attention are on the Middle East and on like grocery prices, inflation, and some other crises that happen in the world, there will be times when people will still pay attention to what is going on in Ukraine. And because of your podcast, because of your work, I feel like more people will have an opportunity to learn more. Even when I came to DC in 2022, there was a huge level of interest in Ukraine across policy circles, media, the broader public. Ukraine was really at the center of attention. Now I do feel that attention has decreased, but that's also a natural part of any news cycles. And I also think that for Washington more broadly, one common misperception is that policy decisions happen very quickly or in a straightforward way. In reality, it's a much more complex and gradual process, and a lot of it depends on having the right information at the right time. That's where this kind of work really matters. And that is why the biggest misperception is people think that, okay, if they avoid this topic, then the war will fix itself somehow, but it means that there will be Ukrainians who will be fighting for their country. There will be people like experts, different journalists who will be supporting Ukraine, who will be talking and covering this topic, as for instance, you guys. And there will be other people who don't care. And that's unfortunately the reality. We are in the long run. So that this is what I always say. If you understand that you are in this field and you're supporting Ukraine, but you're kind of struggling to find even like funding or something else, this is the reality. It will be like this. So it's better to find something in parallel that you can do, like I always say, day job, but you will still have your principles, you will still have your values, and there will be another wave, and you'll keep on doing what you do. Unfortunately, there is no magic solution to anything, and it like my just take is that you know Ukrainians will fight, and this is what we see because Ukrainians want to preserve their country.
I wanted to bring it back in a minute to some of the stuff that you've been working on and as it relates to the occupied territories and such. But given that you touched on your work in the United States and in Washington, I wanted to briefly unpack that a little bit. So you obviously started off more in the journalism space, but now, especially with CEPA, that is more in the policy advocacy, I guess, side of things. And for some listeners of ours who may not be as familiar with how that whole space works in Washington, D.C., could you give us a bit of a feeling of what that work has been like for you since you got there and perhaps how it's changed, over the years, especially with the new administration coming in and what that work has been like?
That's a great question. I think that like CEPA, Center for European Policy Analysis, it's a non-governmental, non-profitable organization. So it means that they just inform the policymakers, and my role hasn't actually been in policy advocacy. It's been more about informing policymakers. So my work focuses on providing information and context about what's happening on the ground, helping people better understand events so they can make informed decisions. It's not like in DC, the space is that you have think tanks, you have policy advocacy groups working on like in the Hill. I think it's a different environment because those people who work in policy advocacy, they actually advocate for something. While I feel like think tanks, they more or less just provide information for policymakers, for people who actually make decisions to make these decisions. So they provide information. While in policy, if you work in policy advocacy, it's more or less you have particular topics and you work only with these topics. So you go on the Hill and you just talk with congressmen, senators, and you just inform them particular how they are supposed to do, what they're supposed to do. While I feel like with think tanks, it's just, if you read any report, it's basically what's going on and recommendations, like what we can do about that, right? But it's not very direct, so policymakers can do whatever with this information. So it's more like providing the information. And I feel like, I really like this angle because in a way it gives me freedom because I can tell different things and I can tell the reality. For me, talking the truth is very important, right? It's very important for me to show what's going on there, but I'm not tied to any particular idea that it should be like this and not, and it should exist only like this. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I just feel that DC is a very big space, and there are people who have been working in DC for many, many years. I just feel that my experience is not really relevant because I wasn't there for a long time, and I think it's with DC you're always learning, and it takes probably years, like 10 years, 15 years to actually become an expert on DC, where you have to be in order to stay there. I'm sure there are people who have stayed there, longer and for many more years, and they can be like good experts on, the DC space. I feel like my knowledge is very limited here, so I'm sorry, guys.
It's all good. Valuable experience nonetheless. So I wanted to bring it back then to your own coverage of Ukraine, and I wanted to bring it back to an instance which I think got a lot more international coverage than perhaps other aspects of this war, which was the Bucha massacre. A couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago at this point, March 31st, there was the Remembrance Day for when that was uncovered. And obviously at the time when that was first covered by international media, the world kind of saw the inhumanity of what went down there, and it was spread all across the world. But obviously, as we've talked about a little bit, recent media coverage has been somewhat muted in comparison, especially with everything else going on in the world at the moment. So just from your perspective personally, how was it for you, first of all, learning about the event and covering it subsequently? And can you relate Bucha to other instances of massacres that have happened in Ukraine? Is this a one-off event, or have there been other, butchers?
Of course, that's definitely not the isolated event. Unfortunately, I was translating for Ukrainska Pravda, and I think we're all shocked by what we saw in Bucha and other settlements in the Kiev region after their liberation. The reality is, wherever Ukrainian or international journalists went after areas that were liberated from Russian forces, they uncovered atrocities committed by the Russian army. We saw this in the Kherson and Kharkiv regions in autumn 2022. Unfortunately, we will likely continue to see more evidence of war crimes in newly liberated territories. When it comes to places like Mariupol, Enerhodar, or other cities that remain under occupation, we know much less simply because there is no access for independent reporting. You and I cannot go there. Bucha, unfortunately, is not the isolated event. It was a well-reported event. That's why we know what happened there. There are places where the same atrocities are being committed daily while we speak with you, but unfortunately, we don't know about them because we don't have the access to them. So my point is that when any territory is liberated, then like if you remember, we got a lot of reporting, international reporting. Journalists from all the media outlets in the world just go there and they report on what they saw there. Because right now we can't go to Mariupol, we can't go to Energodar, we can't go to Crimea, but it doesn't mean that everything is okay there. So that's the thing that I would like our readers and like listeners to understand, that if we don't hear about something, it doesn't mean that it's quiet over there or people agree with what's going on there. It simply means that we don't have the access to these territories. That is why we don't know what's going on there. But it doesn't mean that there is a consent of what's going on there. It just means that we lack the information. And that is why this is important. With the work that you do, that you uncover some of the angles that many journalists or people who are interested in might never even have never thought about, because they just, when we actually get an access to any territory, then we see what was done there, what was going on there. But if we don't have an access, then there is nothing we can talk, unfortunately.
I would like to talk to you about Crimea, which is, of course, your home. Crimea was invaded and came under Russian occupation back in 2014. And I think with Crimea in particular, even compared to other parts of Ukraine, the coverage and the way that people talk about it in the United States and perhaps in Europe as well, especially at this point, almost purely from a geopolitical perspective, right? And obviously, there's quite a bit to be said there, but I'm very interested to hear uh, the human side of that story and what actually happened in Crimea. About a year ago in 2025, you wrote an article on CEPA called Please Do Not Betray My Crimea, where you wrote, Crimea is not just a lump of land. It is the home to many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. In exile or under occupation, it is a part of our soul. So, could you tell us perhaps what your experience was like witnessing that annexation happen in real time?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for this question, Andrew. I just feel that all the people from Ukraine, from Crimea, we are all experiencing the same collective trauma. Well, Crimea is my home, and watching the annexation in 2014 wasn't just political; it was deeply personal. I was not in Crimea at that time. I lived in Kyiv. So for many of us, I have many friends from Crimea. It felt very unreal, because like when you just see it unfolding, you're like, wait, what's going on? Like, why is it happening? But we're just human beings, and sometimes there is nothing we can do about something. So it's just like the level of I can explain to you, and I will try to explain what a person feels, that like your home is being invaded and there is nothing you can do about it. Because in 2014-15, like politicians were talking about, okay, what are we going to do with it? We saw like sanctions, we saw some actions were taken, but that was not enough, because you still saw how your home was invaded, and like the occupation that started. What important to understand is that Crimea didn't ask for all of this, because in 1991 a clear majority supported being part of Ukraine, and then in 2014 what Russia presented as a referendum happened under intimidation and military presence with falsified results. So in 2015, so the narrative that Crimea somehow chose this is simply not true. And, over the past 12 years, life has become increasingly isolated and controlled. People have been forced to take Russian passports. Those who refuse face pressure or worse. There are Ukrainians imprisoned on fabricated charges, and families separated, including cases where children are taken through Crimea deeper into Russia. Many hundreds of thousands have had to leave with no clear path to return. So right now we're talking like if you just meet a Crimean somewhere, in the other part of the world, probably this person doesn't have an opportunity to go back home. At the same time, many Crimean residents Crimeans are fighting in Ukraine's armed forces, because they see this as their home being occupied, and some of them have died in this war. So for me, the simplest way to think about the current state of the things is that Crimea used to be a place anyone could visit freely. Today, it's militarized and dangerous. And the question is, do we accept that as normal, or do we believe that one day it should be a place open to the world again? I believe it should be the latter, but unfortunately, I don't have an answer when we all, like three of us, for instance, can go back to Crimea and see what is going on there. But in my reporting, I tried to cover some of the things, like my recent article where I wrote about. It's not only about Crimea; it's about all the temporarily occupied territories. How people can't even communicate because these tools of communication like WhatsApp or Telegram or any other means, it's just simply not available over there. So you have to have a VPN, but even if you have VPN, this VPN will be unavailable in a couple of days. So you have to buy something else to be able to just communicate freely with the other world. And not all people have this opportunity. So this is how Crimea is becoming more and more isolated. And it's not only Crimea; it's everywhere where Russian forces are going. They just completely shut the territory and they just close the territory. It's basically, we probably can compare it to North Korea, where people just don't know what's going on, and it's particularly the same situation, South Korea and North Korea. So they don't communicate, they don't talk because they are afraid. So the same with the people living under oppression and under occupation, because they are afraid sometimes to speak with people in other parts of Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, because they're afraid that it will be perceived as spying or informing, some like the so-called enemy states or something like this. So that is why it's increasingly hard, and unfortunately, I don't see that. Like I see the solution. I don't know how it will unfold. It's just many, many thousands of people just in a way, they were cut from their homes and they don't know when they will be able to return.
We already covered an episode of Ukraine in which the focus of our attention was over this past winter and the conditions during these past couple of months that were unbelievably harsh to live through, even without Russian bombing. But add to that the systematic attacks on energy centers by the Russians, and you got some really harsh conditions that the Ukrainians had to wrestle through. But when we think of humanitarian aids to Ukraine, what other topics are there that you can think of that need international attention and could benefit from international help?
That's a great question, and thank you for having the episode on winter conditions in early 2026. You basically spoke with a person and uh, given the information on what it feels to be there. And I just my take and my feeling is that it's not going to be easier this winter. For example, I just feel that like Ukrainians living in staying in Ukraine, it's just easier during the spring, summer times, and then starting from autumn, winter. It's just it's getting to be wild where people just try to survive. This is the constant survival mode. But I think um, what you're doing, as I said, the work that you're doing, informing people and giving them a voice, is very critical and really matters. And I think it can change how someone sees this. So if people can't donate, or if they don't have anyone in Ukraine and they just don't care about Ukraine, even listening to your podcast can open their eyes on something. Because if you've never lived under occupation, right, or experienced war, you're like, it's easy to think, well, at least people are alive. How bad can it be? But being alive doesn't mean being safe or free. And under occupation, people's well-being, dignity, and basic rights are constantly under threat. Being in the wartime situation means that you have to constantly just survive. But what you're doing is very important. I just feel like probably at this point, people already chose how they want to react to this war, meaning that those people who support Ukraine and who want Ukraine to win the war and who understand the outcome for all the authoritarian states is decided and is defined on the battlefield in Ukraine right now, they kind of realize that probably they or support Ukraine and Ukraine to win. And then there are people who are just like, whatever, I don't care. And I feel like it's very hard to change the outlook or the way how people think in the second camp, meaning that they don't care, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything about that. And I think your work is important because you are trying to explain what it means by just taking real stories of people, of human beings, and people can relate. It's just very hard for people to relate to someone whose experience they don't have at all, right? But it's still you're trying. Like living in different states in the United States, I understand that there are states who support us, right? Just with people, you just talk randomly in the shops, and they're like, "Oh, wow, I have like a friend. She's also from Ukraine, and yeah, I'm like really sorry what's going on there." And there are like areas where people just don't care, and this is also the reality. We can't do anything about it, right? But we have to do what is dependent on us and what we can control. So that is why, guys, again, thank you so much for doing what you're doing.
Thank you for saying that, and the honor is ours to have you on and to hear your stories. I assure you. So, if you could say anything to those populations in the United States who you just referenced, who either don't really know what's going on in Ukraine, or as we've also discussed over the course of this interview, who simply might not care, if you had a chance to share some human stories of Ukrainians that you've covered either in your Behind the Line series, from your own life, or any experiences that you've had over the course of your career, what stories would you share with them, and what do you wish that people simply knew more about?
That's a great question. I wish I could share more human stories, but I think that it would be impossible to cover even a fraction of them, even right now, And you know that by taking one story, you're trying to show this experience, and it's very hard to show more stories, right? Because then you have to interview more and more people. I just feel that I want people to understand that Ukraine is a very large and diverse country, and it's not a single uniform experience. If you look at the Kherson region in the south, for example, there are areas where people are still living under extremely dangerous conditions, including what can only be described as constant targeting of civilians. It is called the human safari. And there are Ukrainian American journalists who even shoot the documentaries about this human safari in Kherson. And yet people stay because this is their home. There are cities like Slovyansk and Kramatorsk in the eastern part of Ukraine, and you see people holding on to their land, trying not to leave despite the risks. I still, whenever I see the stories or like reels on Instagram showing those people who don't want to leave this territory, and or like it's not necessarily only old people. There are like people with strollers with kids inside, and they just don't want to leave their home, because they understand they have to start from the scratch elsewhere in Ukraine controlled territory. I mean, all these territories that I'm talking about, they are Ukraine controlled, but they are like under constant threat and danger. So people sometimes have to leave somewhere in order to experience like a quieter life. But at the same time, you see there is Kiev, and new businesses are opening, restaurants are running, people are working in defense tech and developing new solutions every day for the rest of the world. And it's a different picture over there. So, like real time solutions are tested somewhere in the eastern part of Ukraine, right, closer to the front lines. But even like in Kiev and all these interceptors that we're talking about, that the whole world is talking about, it's all being developed in Ukraine currently, even though there are territories which are like constant, fire attacks and all of this. Then you talk about Western Ukraine, and you have the Carpathian Mountains resorts over there where life, has taken on a different rhythm. And then you have Odessa, which is in the south of Ukraine. You still see a vibrant coastal city trying to function under wartime conditions. And it's all Ukraine. It's just so different everywhere you look. But I just try to explain that there are millions of human stories over there, and we won't even have time to, talk about all of them. But I think the main thing I want people to understand is that regardless of the situation they are in, people are just still living their lives. They get married, they have children, start businesses, find new jobs, quit their jobs. there is a very strong sense of life continuing even in the most difficult circumstances. And you talk with people living quieter lives right now, even like Ukrainians in other parts of the world, and they say that they feel alive in Ukraine. That's the paradoxical situation that people living under the constant threat feel more alive than somewhere in the safer parts of the world, you know? And I actually hesitate to use the word resilience because I think resilience kind of doesn't show that that there is a price to pay for this resilience in terms of deaths and injuries and fatalities. And sometimes it just sounds too abstract. But what it really is, I think, is that life continuing even when parts of the country are under attack, occupied, and civilians are injured or killed by missile strikes. And it's not just resilience, it's life persistent, whether the world is paying attention to it right now or not. And this is what I want people to understand, that it will be great if they support the right side of the history right now and going in Ukraine. But even if they don't, it will still be unfolding and people will still try to live their best lives and try to live the lives and, hoping that life will win over the death. So it's a hard idea to accept, but I feel that this is what it is. It's great when we can have more people on the right side of the history, and we hope to have more. But on the other hand, if people just pay attention to other things, it doesn't mean that people in Ukraine will stop fighting and that they will choose the death over life.
100%. And I think those are fantastic words to essentially bring this conversation to its unfortunate end. I mean, I'd love to spend hours more discussing this with you. Um, Before we do go, and I wanted to already thank you for the time that you've taken to talk with us and to share all of this knowledge and experience with us. I wanted to give you the opportunity, just if you know of any organizations you think that could do with some help, or even, as you say, like the sharing of experiences is one of the most important things. So are there any, beyond your obviously fantastic publications, but are there any other, outlets that you think listeners could listen to or read and inform themselves about the war?
Well, definitely they should listen more to your podcast and to the work that you're doing because it's important. They should definitely read Behind the Lines and Behind the Lines tracker. I try my best to devote my time to doing it because I think that it's important. And who knows what will happen in 10, 20 years. And, I'm sure what we see right now with the current war, it's like overproduction of information, right? And this is like everything is unfolding in real time, and that is why it's also interesting and sad at the same time because we see so many atrocities happening in the real time. And there is nothing we can do sometimes about it, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to stop. We still have to do about that. But I just feel like in terms of like fundraisers, probably people know. I mean, there are many fundraisers in the United States like Razom, United Help Ukraine, and Nova Ukraine. But in Ukraine, I personally like to support an initiative called Wow Vdoma. It means it's better at home. It's a group of my friends, journalists, lawyers, cybersecurity specialists, and they help internally displaced people. Internally displaced people are those who relocated within the country from temporarily occupied territories. They are also supporting the rehabilitation of soldiers. But honestly, if you want to support any organization and you're not sure about its credibility, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to help verify them because I understand there are so many of them. In terms of information, I feel like we're living in this overproduction digital age where even if you say, well, please read or listen to that, people will still listen to their own things. It's just how the information works. But I just feel, again, I want to encourage everyone on the right side of the history to do what they're supposed to do, even though there will be moments when we don't understand why we do what we do, but we have to do it. And then there will be another wave. And I feel like in anything in life, everything is temporarily. You can do this thing today and you just feel like you value this work and you know that it's important. There will be another time, even maybe better, even worse. We don't know it at this point, but we have to do what we believe in because then it's kind of hard to just live without any purpose in life, right? So we just have to be human beings. Sometimes we are sad, sometimes we're happy, but that's our life, and we just have to do what we think is right, you know. And thank you so much for bringing me to your podcast and for doing your work. Please continue doing it. It's important.
With that endorsement, we certainly will. So thank you so much for your kind words, but also for your time. It's been amazing. And we look forward to staying in touch and continuing this conversation further.
Yeah, it's been an honor having you on today. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
This has been an episode of the St. Martin's Cloak podcast. Today is April 19th, 2026. Thank you all for listening, and stay safe.